Hey everyone, Ms. Digital Editor Carmen Rios here with the founder and executive director and assisting executive director of Black Women's Blueprint, so Farah Tanis and Sevonna Brown. Thank you both so much for being here with me today. I'm super excited to talk to you. And your speech was amazing. I hope that everyone who has not watched the stream of that plenary watches it now. It was amazing. And you touched on so much of the stuff that I wanted to talk to you about, but I felt like most important was that you were visioning. And I think a lot of times we get so caught up as advocates and activists in where we are instead of where we wish we were. And so I'm really curious to just sort of see what is the world that you all are working towards, and what do you think it's going to take right now for us to start paving the way towards something, I think, honestly, your vision bigger and better than we've ever imagined.
Absolutely. And I think it's incredibly important that you said you use the term visioning, and visioning as a process, right? Visioning as a journey. I think for all of us as advocates, as feminists, as a radical anti-oppression, activists, we need to be visioning constantly, because that is the only way we're going to get to the world that we want to see. Right. And so that's why it was so incredibly important for me to really foreground that notion that all of us need to rise. All of us need to really transform our movements. And that is the way that we grow. And so it was very important to say that. I vision truth, justice, healing, and reconciliation, as we all do at Black Women's Blueprint. And I think it's something that needs to happen not only in our strategies and our external work as advocates, but I think internally. As a movement, we've been fragmented. We can talk about the Women's March and the March for Black Women. We can talk about several other, even the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements that have experienced fragmentation. There is nothing wrong with conflict. Conflict takes us to the place where we can grow through compassion and through listening and through restoration. And so we have to welcome and not be afraid to step into those uncomfortable moments so that we can indeed see the world we want actualized.
Yes, I'm like,
love to add.
Yeah.
This morning so the keynote was spectacular, as you saw, but we also had a chance to do a deep dive in Our Bodies as Ecstasy, the workshop this morning. And we were talking about dreaming, right? What is a world where we can dream outside of capitalism, outside of sexism, outside of racism? And a lot of folks said they hadn't had the space to actually dream about liberatory power, collective liberation, and individual liberation. And so that's really what we're thinking about at Black Women's Blueprint, is how do we mobilize around our own individual healing, but also around our collective vision for what freedom looks like. And part of that is visioning justice. It's a hashtag that we use, but it's also one of our campaigns around imagining a world outside of the criminal justice system, for example, imagining a world that is free of violence, imagining a world that is where we eradicate child sexual abuse, where it's not even in the forefront of our experiences anymore, but our healing and our liberation and our ecstasy, our joy is really what is pivotal and central in our lives. And so that's something that we practice on a daily basis at Black Women's Blueprint, in our ritual, in our coming and going, in all of the campaigns that we do and that we aspire towards, is really like our collective liberation and freedom.
So awesome. And I mean, both of you are fighting back from, the intersections of race, gender, and violence, especially at this conference. That's what we're focusing on. And I noticed that, there's a lot of conversations happening at this year's conference about how to do better and looking inward and figuring out, how do we unravel the white supremacy in this movement? How do we challenge ourselves to really step up to the plate? And so as leaders on that front, what does an inclusive, a radically intersectional movement to end violence really look like? I think so many of us, are sort of just starting to get there. What do you think that it really does look like to make that bold move?
Can you take that?
Yeah, sure. I think and Farah spoke to this earlier, it's an incredibly self-reflexive process. It's a restorative process where folks can sit and circle and hold people accountable. Like, for harm that happens within the movement, there's a lot of misogyny and sexism inside of the anti-violence movement, right? And so for us to all look at where the isms live within us and to be truthful about that, and then also to call in community members who harm us, right? Whether it's another organization or another colleague or friend or even someone in our own families, right? Starting to undo and unmake the harm on a daily basis and on like even just a micro level, I think will be an example for the macro changes that we really want to see, because that's really where the transformation lies. And if we feel like we're not practicing it in integrity, then it's not going to ripple effect out into our communities. So it's really about us exhibiting that example within ourselves and within, you know, our community or our organization, or even on our own block, right? So we're based in Brooklyn, and there are Black women and girls who walk up and down the sidewalk every single day. And so this week, we're on the West Coast, but back on the East Coast, we had a solidarity economy effort that young women between the ages of 11 and 19 had a Black girl flea market. And so they exposed our space to the community, made our space relevant, and just elevated and amplified their own work and exercised their own power and their own autonomy right there in Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy, right? So I think those kinds of transformative efforts where we define justice for ourselves, we define our own economics for ourselves, we define what solidarity looks like, and building trust between Black girls again, right? Because that's something that's been broken and harmed, again, by capitalism, competition, and infighting. So those micro are really just the magnified experiences that we want to lift up and practice.
And, you know, to answer even further in terms of your questions about inclusivity, I think that, you know, to be truly inclusive is to have each other's back. As I said in my, you know, in my speech, in my comments to the audience, you know, it's not about speaking for one another. None of us can really speak to each other's experience in the authentic way that is required by someone who has lived that experience. But we have to realize that our experiences, our oppressions, and our victories are intertwined with the other, right? No matter what the diversity of our backgrounds are, I think showing up for each other and having each other's back is a value that we need to live by. I also think that inclusivity includes standing up for each other, sharing resources with each other. When, for example, we know that a trans-identified women's organization is struggling, we need to show up. When we know that Black Women's Blueprint is being shut down by Facebook because of their new policies around certain terms we can't use, and because we can't promote the March for Black Women, that means other organizations and other groups need to show up for Black women. When we see that our sisters and brothers and siblings from the global South are experiencing like oppression, where their children are being ripped from their very arms and they are being separated, that means that we all show up. So to be truly intersectional, to me, in addition to what we all know intersectionality to mean, also means that we put it into practice in a way that, again, says that an oppression, an offense, an act of violence against one of us is an act of violence and an oppression against all of us, right? Not just in voice, but in action. We have to show up for each other.
Yes, and you know, so there was a screening of The Rape of Recy Taylor on Wednesday night, and I got to talk to two of the producers from that film yesterday. And there's this phrase that was used in that film, the infrastructure of injustice, and it was just, you know, so jarring to watch that film and see this story that you want to be able to tell yourself, like, that was so long ago that things are different now, but so much of it was still so relevant. And, you know, you specifically were part of this, you chaired this commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that focused on connecting those dots between, you know, these legacies of institutionalized racism and sexism that still manifest in contemporary violence. And so I'm interested too in what solutions you all are working towards in more of a practical sense, more of a day-to-day sense, what solutions you think we need to start pushing for, and maybe that we're pushing for with the March for Black Women's Lives, that will finally break that cycle of violence that's been going on for generations and centuries?
I think our solutions are multi-pronged, right? And so we know in the movement that folks talk about prevention, and they talk about a spectrum, right? They do prevention work should be approached across a spectrum, including the individual, the relational, the communal, the societal. We are looking at going beyond, those sort of 4 or 5 segments, or those 4 or 5 levels. We're looking at also addressing the structural issues that are rooted and deeply rooted in the historical factors. And so that healing that needs to happen is multi-generational, right? That undoing, that unpacking, that dismantling of the systems can't happen if we just stop at the societal, because with the societal, it's not, what is it about the societal that makes it tangible enough to say, society is just this way. It's almost like society is this sort of thing that is not made up of people, right? And we know that this society is fueled and was created and is sustained by a structure that existed before societal culture, exists, at least in contemporary times, before this societal culture existed. And then that structure was created out of a very real history that treated my ancestors like objects, that treated my ancestors like commodity, right? To be bred, to be, to engage in labor, to engage in, to be forced to give their own lives and take the lives of their own children so that they would ensure freedom. And so we've had to make some incredible choices. And I think what needs to happen now, because we see the parallel between what was happening to a lot of our ancestors, at least in the Black community, when it comes to rape, when it comes to reproductive violations, we see the same patterns continuing to repeat themselves. History has not changed that much, right? And so when we see that, we think to ourselves, those radical acts that were done by Ida B. Wells, by Sojourner Truth, by Harriet Tubman, by civil rights leaders like Ella Baker, Johnny Tillman, by Fannie Lou Hamer, that we ourselves are the present day, Fannie Lou Hamers, right? And the Ella Bakers and the Ida B. Wells and the Harriet Tubmans. And we need to be as radical in our action and in our interventions in order to end violence against women, against trans folks, against children, and the violence of men in particular against other men. And so it's incredibly important for us to look at all of those layers, and we need to expand our conversations beyond intersectionality, right? Which explains and gives us a wonderful framework for talking about oppression and for talking about the interlocking oppressions based on our identities. We need to think also about those various and those different layers of identities that are not so tangible, right? What is magic in us? What gives us drive? What causes us to be able to create, to march, to revolutionize, right? Those are also aspects of ourselves, at least for me, that I believe are just as critical as my race, as my gender, as my class, right? My spirituality, my lineage. Those are incredibly important. And these are the technologies that we as Black folks have used for centuries to be able to win, and so why not do it now, right? Why not do it now? And even to get even more practical about it, I think that folks talk about dismantling, the system. We're approaching the midterm elections, right? I think that there are those of us who believe that, shifting Congress or, there's a lot of change that can happen. I don't want to get too political here on because I don't want to, any problems. However, we all know what we have to do, right? We all know what we have to do. I think our policies need to change. That's one thing, but we can't depend on our elected officials. It's got to be us. It's got to be us creating these accountability measures, not only to dismantle and address white supremacy when it shows up, but also misogyny, sexism, transphobia when it shows up in our communities. And I think that there are models. In fact, I know there are models that already exist out there, but no one is using them. Not enough of us are seeing those models because most of us are thinking, oh, we need to create our own models. When these models exist, they've existed for a very long time. And still till this day, we have pioneers. We have brilliant brothers and sisters and siblings who have created frameworks that give us those practical steps for ending violence against women and for doing it in community with or without funding, with or without resources. And so I think that those exist. We need to search them out. We need to create a list of who they are, and we need to have them teach us because we need to learn.
Awesome. Do you have any? And so tell me about the March for Black Women's Lives. I'm the March for Black Women. I am really.
Lives is wonderful. I love that.
I was like, is that did I mess up the name?
It is for Black Women's Lives. It's a march for our lives and our bodies, you know?
And so when is it happening? How can folks get involved? And sort of what's the inception story there? Why are you doing it?
Mm-hmm.
So the March for Black Women, it's actually the second annual March for Black Women. Last year, we converged with the March for Racial Justice. This year, we're standing on our own 2 feet, and we're going to be in DC on September 30th on the National Mall, and also September 29th, that's right, on the National Mall and at Freedom Plaza. And September 30th is actually in Brooklyn. So September 29th will be a day of civic engagement, civic dialogues. There'll be voter registration there. There'll also be lots of rallying, public speak outs, survivor storytelling and survivor-centered healing and advocacy. And then on September 30th, we'll be doing a countdown to the VAWA expiration. So the Violence Against Women Act is set to expire on September 30th. And so at midnight, we'll be gathering in a park in Brooklyn, which we'll share with you all the location and the exact timing that we want you to come out. But we're gonna have a flower and candlelit visual to really reflect deeply and celebrate the lives of Black women who we have lost, but also to look specifically at what the impact of the reauthorization or the expiration of VAWA really means to us in the material conditions of our lives, as Farah always says. And so it really is a march for Black women's lives. Last year, I mean, there were Black women all over the National Mall, catching their glad, dancing, singing, protesting, raging together, and also waging war, really. What is the next year, 2 years, 8 years look like for us as Black women? And that's where that visioning comes from. And so on September 19th, you can join us for a conversation at the Schomburg around a new social contract for Black women, which I'd love for Farah to talk a little bit more around the economic survival of Black women and how we can also add that and elevate that in our conversation as we forge ahead to the March for Black Women. And so you can find the March for Black Women on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. It's really all over. marchforblackwomen.org will lead you to how to sign up, how to register, how to start a sister march, how to join a caravan. So even if you're not in DC or you're not in New York, you can still participate and be a part of the March for Black Women. I was talking to a sister today at INSAC, and she was like, I'm all the way out in Hawaii and there's not that many Black women there. And I was like, if you all just have to gather and sit on your living room floor and talk about what this moment means to Black women, then you are living in the legacy of the March for Black Women. So show up how you can, show out how you can, write an op-ed, share us on Facebook. We are being blocked right now by Facebook, unfortunately. So partner with us, be boots on the ground, flyer with us, door knock with us, and really just be a part of this legacy and this conversation. It's not just one day, it's not just 2 days, 2 cities, but it's a national impact, and it's a national transformational moment for us all to get together and to really be in coalition with one another. So thank you to everyone who has already supported the March for Black Women, and there's multiple points of entry and insertion. So continue to support and elevate the work of the March for Black Women. Please give. There's a CrowdRise. You can start a team on CrowdRise. Every dollar, every penny counts. So we are really hoping to make this a grassroots, in the words of Ella Baker, a grassroots organizing effort. So we call on everyone. And it is a march for Black women. It's for Black women. So that means everyone has a role. It's not just Black women who are shouldering this work, but, you know, think about your role as an ally, as a Black man, you know, as a Latinx individual, as a trans individual. What is your role in the March for Black Women? And how do you want to show up for yourself, for your community, and in support of survivors who are making their way to the National Mall on September 29th?
Awesome. And then did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and then we have a number of pre-March events happening. On September 19th, we are going to be at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture with our partner, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, NESRI, from 6 to 8. The Schomburg is hosting us, and we are going to be having critical conversations about what it would mean to have a new social contract for Black and Latinx women, right? And so that conversation is going to be incredible and critical. It is timely during this time, again, as we approach the midterm election, to really look at what the economic security or insecurity, you know, what it is, what's been happening with Black and Latinx women, and to look at alternatives, to create our own blueprint for change around the economy, to create our own blueprint around solidarity economy and new economies and barter economies, so that we can ensure our own economic viability and our own future. And so we really invite you, if you have anything to say, if you want to engage in learning exchange with us, please show up on September 19th. Prior to the march as well, on September 28th in DC, prior to the DC September 29th march, we're going to have a fly-in with the Congressional Black Caucus for Women and Girls. And so please go on blackwomen'sblueprint.org, where you can click on the march, or the March for Black Women, in order to gain more information. Also email us, please, at info@blueprintny.org if something is not clear, or you need more information, or you need to know how to get survivors, especially survivors, to the march. This is our task right now. And our crowd rise is, you know, it's going strong, but every little bit counts. And so we ask you to be in solidarity economy with us and help survivors get to the march. Thank you.
Awesome. And so my closing question is the same. I've been asking this question of everyone I've talked to at the conference, which is that the theme is bold moves, ending sexual violence in one generation. And that's going to take many bold moves to make it happen. And so I'm just sort of curious as to what's the next bold move for Black Women's Blueprint? What's the next bold move y'all are taking as individual activists and advocates? Just what's on the horizon after the conference, after the march? What's next?
No, we're looking to 2020. 2020 is the 10th anniversary of our launch as an organization. And at that 2020 is definitely that. And so really what we see is really bringing community together and sharing all of our models, you know. So we are going to go into a deep dive. In my conversation with the audience today, one of the things I said is we need to engage in some critical self-examination, all of us in the movement. And we need to sit with ourselves and engage in periods of study, because we're going to need to be stronger, you know, in the next 2 years, in the next 4 years, you know, we're going to need to be much stronger. And so let's refine our skills. Let's know what we're talking about. Let's share our models. Let's create this new economy of activists and organizations that are really caring for each other and that are sharing resources, so that each of our communities can be liberated. And so that's what we're doing. We're going inward over the next 2 years, planning for towards our 2020, where we will come out and we will share all of these wonderful models and all of our learnings, and we will celebrate together with, my gosh, the hundreds of organizations that have made our work possible, that have inspired us, and the hundreds of feminists, Black feminists, transnational feminists, feminists from the global South that have truly, truly inspired our work. And so that's really the next step for us after the march.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again so much. This was fantastic. Such a really invigorating and empowering way to end the week. And thank you for being here, and thank you for everything you're doing. And everyone, go click on Black Women's Blueprint in the description. Go to marchforblackwomen.org. Let's get this thing going. Let's show solidarity and support. So yeah, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
All right, signing off.
In the struggle.